Hello there and a very good evening. This is Face the Nation. We're coming to you live and direct from our state-of-the-art Stein Studio Complex here in Ratmalana. I'm Sonali Vaniga-Badage. Now, as we speak, the political stage is on fire. Lots of melodrama going on. The Constitution being reread. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution being revisited by legal luminaries. The President, the Prime Minister, the former President, parliamentarians, all in a scurry. While the political stage hots up, we here at Face the Nation thought of discussing certain issues that impinge directly upon the lives of the citizens of the Republic. Today's topic of discussion is poverty alleviation, inequality and rural development in Sri Lanka. Amidst the multi-mega development projects in Sri Lanka, where are we really progressing to in terms of economic development? What is the rural populace to do in such a backdrop? We've invited to our studios three eminent guests. I begin with Professor Sirimal Abeyaratne. He's a professor in economics at the University of Colombo. Good evening and welcome to the show, Professor.
Good evening.
I'd also like to welcome Dr. Udan Fernando, Executive Director of SEPA. Good evening and welcome to you. We'll also be joined by Venerable Professor W. Vimalaratana Thera, who's the head of the Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. Professor Sirimal Abeyaratne, my first question is to you. Right now we see Sri Lanka moving towards an era of development. Tourism is booming. There are multi-mega development projects. There's the financial city on the one hand, there's the megapolis on the other. A lot of foreign direct investment coming in as well, and the facilitations being made for these mega development projects. But on the other hand, we have rural development. We have the country's masses who are suffering. How does one balance this all?
I would say that you can't separate the two. Because when we look at the rural population and their livelihood, agriculture basically, and their living standards, and all these things are related not only to rural development but also to the entire development effort of the country. So there are certain structural issues that we need to understand. Probably my good friend Udan will talk about poverty and inequality in this particular area, because SEPA has done a lot of research in this particular area. But let me begin with one simple thing. We know that Sri Lanka has invested so much and implemented so much rural development policies, regional development policies for decades. But still, we are talking about rural poverty, rural inequality and their livelihood problems, and as you said, they are suffering. And why is that so? Because the rural sector is, if it is isolated from the rest of the country, rest of the global economy, obviously you may have to face that problem. Because if you can't take a village development, you can't take a development of a particular location in isolation, because that is connected to Colombo, that is connected to megapolis, that is connected to foreign direct investment, even that should be connected to Hambantota and Mattala, all these development projects and highways and expressways. So but still we are talking about that rural people, those who are in agriculture, they are suffering, their income is low, they are helpless, and they are important only during election time, not the other times, and all these things are actually related to the entire development process. Why do I say that? Now, for example, the basic problem that I see in the rural sector is too many people are producing too little. so that the average production per head, or if you translate it to income, average income per head becomes very thin and thin and thin. So thinner and thinner, which means actually we should understand their livelihood is not going beyond that level, and if they progress in their livelihood, in their occupation, in their agriculture activity, that has been very slow compared to the other sectors of the economy. In fact, we should also understand that when the country is developed, there should be a movement of labor from rural sector to the other sectors, and also we talk about labor shortages of this country right now in manufacturing sector, in many services sectors. But at the same time, we know that it is not because, well, there are a lot of arguments about this, why there is a labor shortage, and according to some people it is only a Colombo phenomena, not in the rest of the country. True. Why? Because our labor is particularly in wrong places, and agriculture is one wrong place where nearly 1/3 of people got concentrated. I believe that they should move out of that sector and supporting agriculture sector development as well as the development of the other sectors.
Professor, you spoke about policies. Are these policies successfully implemented, or is there an issue there as well? Because if the policies are successfully implemented, then rural communities must be getting lesser, right?
I wouldn't say that they are not successfully implemented, but the success that we would like to see is not there. And if you can't take it in isolation again. Now, I have seen certain rural development projects which have actually majority of these rural development projects. They take the rural sector or the village or any location in isolation of the rest of the country, in isolation of the global economy.
So this is a fundamental flaw, right? This is a fundamental flaw. To look at it in isolation is a fundamental flaw.
No,
so that's
a wrong approach, I guess. I believe that's a wrong approach, because the Colombo development and development in the urban sector helps rural sector, development in manufacturing sector, development in the service sector helps rural sector, agriculture sector. How? Because there are production linkages as well as labor linkages. So when the manufacturing development, when the service sector development takes place, labor, people coming from rural sector actually join this sector, even if we like it or not. When with education, actually rural sector people they have been moving away from that sector to the other sector, to the urban sector. In fact, I don't look at it in a negative sense. I see it as a positive thing, because in a developed society, in a rich society, few people are in agriculture, but they produce big amount.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Sirimal Abe-Ratna, Professor in Economics at the University of Colombo. I move my attention to Dr. Udan Fernando, Executive Director of the Center for Poverty Analysis. Dr. Fernando, if we take a look at the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, in Goal 1 it says, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. By 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. Can you draw some perspective here in terms of the situation in Sri Lanka? How are we faring?
Thank you. I think let's take a time span of about 25 years, and in the 90s, Sri Lanka's poverty was measured at 28%, and I must say that this is income poverty, which has its own limitations, but I'll come to that later. But if you go by the standard definition, which is income-based poverty, which is based on a poverty line, it was 28% in the mid-90s, and a few years back it came down to 6.7, and by now and I base my figures at the latest Household Income and Expenditure Survey, HIS 2016, poverty has come down to 4.1%.
Right.
So statistically speaking, numerically speaking, there is a progress in terms of alleviating poverty.
Okay.
It has come down from 28% some years back to 4.1. So one would say that we have achieved a lot. But that's part of the story. At one level, there is some progress, but the measurement has its own limitations. So I would like to share that with you. Absolutely. In the first instance. So if you go by a superficial way of measuring poverty, yes, there's some progress, but that's not good enough.
Right. So where exactly are we going wrong? Is it in the policy, or is it in the implementation of policy, or is it the fact that the necessary stakeholders aren't coming together, or are we lacking awareness? Where are we going wrong?
I think it's now let me elaborate my first point a bit further. I said poverty is measured by a particular measurement, which is income, and that's limited. And you see only part of the picture by looking at the income, but there are other dimensions of poverty. Right. So that's one thing. But there are also, these figures are macro figures, average figures. So 4.1 is a national figure. But if you break down the national figure into 3 sectors, namely urban, rural, which is our subject, and estate. So these are the 3 sectors in the economy. The urban sector poverty is 1.9. So it's lower than the national figure, which is 4.1. But if you take the rural, it's higher. It's 4.3. And if you take the estate sector poverty, it's 8.8. So you see a disparity at the sectoral level,
right.
And this disparity is further reflected across districts and provinces. So there is a problem of unequal distribution of the benefits.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Udan Fernando, Executive Director of SEPA. We'd also like to very respectfully welcome on our program Venerable Professor W. Vimalaratanathera, Head of the Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. Good evening and welcome to the show, Venerable Thera. My first question to you is, you've been an academic in this field of economics and socio-economics, which is the topic of discussion today. Sri Lanka has been known as an agriculture-rich economy. However, we are also living in a day and age where farmers are at wit's end because of their helplessness, as they don't get a proper price for their rice or harvest sometimes. Why is it that we are going through this stage, living in Sri Lanka, with all the positive conditions, the tropical climate, with all of those positive factors in place? Why is it that our farmers are still struggling in Sri Lanka?
Well, it is a really good question. We always emphasize marketing issues. For me, there are so many other issues in addition to marketing problem. When we look at farmers in Sri Lanka, especially in the domestic agriculture, they have small farmlands. Land fragmentation is going on. In the future, average farmland size will go down further. If we take simple example, something like this, when you are looking at a small farmer and his household, you would have the perception of that this household is poor. Their main source of income is farming, cultivation. If a village is taken with similar farmers, that village is also poor. If you take DS division with similar households, DS division is also poor, and you can go to district level and also provincial level. To come out this rural poverty, my opinion is shifting poor farmers away from agriculture to industries and services. Farmland size is small, so that they cannot earn sufficient income out of that. When you look at agriculturally advanced countries, say for example Australia, average farm size is 10,000 acres. USA, average farm size is 200 acres. Ours is really small. If you want to bring these poor farmers out of their poverty, you have to introduce new livelihoods, basically creating productive jobs in industrial and service sector. And when we look at rural poverty, urban poverty is low, and next rural poverty. The highest is the poverty level in the estate sector. When you look at the contribution to total poverty in Sri Lanka, nearly 80% of total poverty is coming from rural areas. So that poverty is basically rural issue in Sri Lanka.
Right. Thank you very much, Venerable Professor Vimala Ratanathera, Head of the Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. I'm joined by Charitha Fernando and Nadeem Majid. Charitha, first question to you.
Thank you, Sonali. My first question is to Venerable Thero. Going by the election results of the local government polls, do you see a nexus between this Western province focused development projects and poverty, the outcome of the poll? Is there a nexus between these two?
Well, when I look at your question, we have to think of short-term, medium-term and long-term solutions. If we look at the recent outcome of the local government election in rural areas, rural people, especially farmers, had a big issue. That is fertilizer issue. They are not in a position to purchase fertilizer. In addition to that, prices are also high, fertilizer prices. Similarly, in the past, climatic condition, weather condition was not in favorable for cultivation. So that agricultural sector was recording minus growth. So their income is low. At the same time, when they are starting farming, the fertilizer is not available. Similarly, marketing issues, some other issues are there. In addition to that, most of Sinhala Buddhist people living in rural areas, and certain initiatives taken by the new government, for me, speed is not acceptable. You have to introduce certain reforms slowly, and some reforms introducing too much to Sinhalese people in the countryside.
If you can elaborate a bit on those examples, Thero, you mentioned that some policies were not acceptable.
If I am going to elaborate some policies, certain people would think this would be a political answer. Say for example, national anthem issue. Rural people feel it is not good. It should be only in Sinhala. I do not agree with that, but we have to understand the reality in the country. Later on, little by little, you can introduce certain reforms. And when you look at the northern and eastern province of the country, some power-hungry politicians making unacceptable, unnecessary statements there. And media, most of the time, unnecessarily highlighted those perhaps small statements. They are also struggling with their vote base. When you look at newspapers and TV channels, they are focusing on the market, so that they are highlighting unnecessary issues, so that you cannot win the rural Sinhala people that is there. In addition to economic issues, social, cultural, those issues are there. And also, former president is a leader to most of rural people. Why? He won the war. All know that. So rural people especially, they have a great respect to him. That was also there. So many factors contributed for this result. Not one, number of factors together.
Dr. Fernando, I have a question for you on, you mentioned flaws in the calculation of poverty in Sri Lanka. They came across a very interesting fact. The World Bank last year in a Q&A called Understanding Poverty in Sri Lanka noted that our poverty line is based on data from 2002. How reliable is any calculation on poverty in Sri Lanka based on 15-year-old data?
Yeah, it's an inherent kind of limitation. Let me not put it as a flaw, but it's an inherent limitation. But let me explain the basis we use for the latest information that I gave you, which is 4.1. And for the information for audience, I should say, put things simply, it's poverty line is drawn based on a particular measurement, which is income, which is good enough to meet certain costs or expenses to keep oneself going, and it's mere survival, and it's measured on the basis of the a particular number of kilocalories. 2030 kilocalories per day, right? So in order to generate that much of energy per day, we need 4,166 rupees per month per person. And this includes for food as well as for non-food items such as housing, energy and so on. So 4,166 rupees per person per month, which means about 138 rupees per day. So the facts, these figures would speak for themselves, right? And you can understand it's the minimum, it's the bare minimum, right? And if we lift the poverty line by a little bit, the degree of poverty goes up, and also the absolute number of people living under poverty. Right now it is about 843,000, would go up, in a big way. So it's not realistic. But we need to start from somewhere.
But don't you think that that those changes should be made in order to ensure that policy making is better informed?
I mean, this has been a constant kind of plea from a lot of think tanks, including ourselves, the Center for Poverty Analysis, to come up with a realistic poverty line for better policy. So, and it's not SEPA only which has kind of clamored for this change. So many other think tanks and also beyond Sri Lanka, and already this is taken into account by some agencies. For instance, if you take Samurdhi, although there are certain limitations in terms of targeting, they are not using the traditional kind of measurement. They would give away a bit of margin, and they would also accommodate the changes that would be caused by certain shocks. For instance, inflation, temporary illnesses, disasters would change one's poverty level drastically if one is subject to these shocks. So if you take the stock of Samurdhi recipients, it's bigger than 843,000. If I refer the latest amount, it's 1.4 million households or families. So the social safety network has taken into account to some extent, but it's not good enough.
So in this backdrop, how reliable or how much weight should we give to the household income and expenditure survey when formulating policy?
No, I think there should be some starting point. I would accept, but it's what we should do is not to treat that as the only parameter. And there are so many other calculations. You don't need to scrap or get rid of HIES. I'm not recommending that. You can start with that. You can have that margin, which is very, very. You can scientifically calculate the shocks, because certain levels of incomes are hovering around the poverty line very closely. So if poverty line is increased or change fluctuates, the corresponding effect is huge. So you can scientifically calculate that and then accommodate the impact, the shocks that will go beyond the stock of poverty, which is calculated based on the poverty line.
Reverend Professor, you mentioned that most of Sri Lanka's extreme poor live in rural Sri Lanka, which is true. 85% of the population is rural, and the majority of the poor is also from rural, these pockets of extreme poverty that you find in Monoragala, in Batticaloa, Kirinochi, Mana, the former war-torn areas. But at the same time, the same World Bank report that I'm referring to also says that there are significant numbers of poor people living in urban centers. 7.7% of the entire population of poor, of the country's poor, are residing in Kurunegala, close to urban Kurunegala, let's say. Do you feel that when it comes to making policy, successive governments have neglected the urban poor? Because we see that even in Colombo, the country's capital, there are significant numbers of people who do not have the same access to opportunities that the rest of us have.
Now, that is quite good question. Even though urban poverty percentage is low, when you look at the national contribution to the poverty, absolute figure is high. Why is that? Population density in urban areas high. Successive government, I feel overemphasize rural sector. we would have implemented urban-centered settlement patterns rather than promoting people to go away from urban to rural areas. Our mentality, I mean Sri Lankan mentality, not to live in urban areas, to live in rural areas. Even though they are not contributing to rural economy, they are daily traveling from rural area to urban areas. Urban poverty would have been gone down if the successive government paid sufficient attention to urban development. If it was the case, daily traveling from rural areas to urban areas would have gone down. Similarly, daily traffic problem would have also gone down. Unfortunately, even now, we are not developing urban areas properly. If you look at the total population of Sri Lanka, it is not big compared to many countries. I know population density is high, but total population is something 20 million. If you look at population in Delhi, Beijing, that is bigger than our total population. If you look at population in Tokyo, that is something 38 million. In India, Indian Railway carries passengers something similar to Sri Lankan population every day. Hypothetically, we can bring all the Sri Lankan population to Colombo. Hypothetically, we can't do that, I know. If it is the case,
Reverend Professor, just very quickly, you mentioned that we can one of the key projects that this government has harped on soon after even before coming into power was this whole idea of this Western Province megapolis. However, in the megapolis project, do you feel that you mentioned the need for people to move closer to their workplaces? But one of the key issues here is the lack of affordable housing. Do you feel that even in the megapolis project, enough attention is being paid to affordable housing for Sri Lankans, for people who are living and working in this country, rather than people who are purchasing apartments and whatnot as investments?
For me, even though words are there and propaganda is there, you have to see what is actually happening. After President Premadasa, I haven't seen much development in urban settlements. Now, private sector is developing urban settlements, those settlements not for ordinary people, rich people. We have to develop settlements for ordinary people. If it is the case, urban poor people's poverty will go down. When you look at household income and expenditure surveys in Sri Lanka, large percentage of household income goes for house rents. And perhaps you are living in a rented house. You know the gravity of the issue. And when you compare this with our neighboring countries, our housing rents not acceptable. If we pay sufficient attention to develop urban settlements, private sector will not do that. Government can do that, not to make profits out of that. It would be a national service it would be a long-term investment to many issues, including the road congestions. If you calculate how many years you are spending in your lifetime for traveling, I have talked to some of my students, they have calculated, some of them from their kindergarten until they die. Some of them have to spend nearly 7 years, 8 years their lifetime for traveling. Can we accept that? No, we cannot accept that. They should have sufficient accommodation in urban areas. Since they are working in urban areas, their kids are attending to urban schools or universities. If they are living in urban areas comfortably, their cost of living will go down.
Thank you,
Professor
very much,
Aberatna.
Professor.
Just quickly, one quick question for you on this subject of spatial exclusivism. I mean, we see that from our workplace. I mean, across the road, you go down Vauxhall Street, and you see an entirely different city to what you see on the other side of Union Place. You've been in this field of economics for a long time. You've spoken on policy matters. You've advised on economic policy as well. Do you feel that? Do you agree with Reverend Professor Vimalratana when he says that since President Premadasa, there hasn't been any real consideration when it comes to affordable urban housing?
I think in answering this question, we can't go by emotions, and Venerable Sir already confirmed and substantiated my argument that I also brought about the rural sector, and also the one that you are raising is about the urban sector. I think that not only in this particular area, but even if you look at the country's policy reform process, the major purposive, bold, comprehensive policy reform processes, there were only 2 times it happened, in 1977 and in 1989. That was also during the time of President Premadasa. And since 1989 up to now, more than 25 years, there have been no substantial policy reform. There have been a lot of ad hoc changes, overnight changes, which I would say would have distorted the entire business world, entire economic activities, but no that much focus, no that much emphasis on a comprehensive, bold reform process throughout the past 25 years. We have a lot of talks, we have a lot of plans like the megapolis and like some other big plans, and to bring Sri Lanka to a position in between Singapore and Dubai, similar to that kind of position. I know that Sri Lanka has much more potential than Singapore and Dubai, but still all those things are talks only.
Right. Thank you very much. Professor Aberatna, before we go in for a short commercial break, when we speak about inequality and poverty alleviation, we can't be blind to the fact that our main foreign remittances come from Sri Lankan women who are exported as housemaids to the Middle East under deplorable conditions. They sometimes return battered, bruised, maimed, sometimes in coffins, sometimes pregnant. This has become an ugly reality in Sri Lanka, and this amounts to modern day slavery. We keep having conversations about this issue, however, to no avail. How do we resolve this? How do we overcome this?
If you have an increasing remittance flow to the country, it is not a sign of prosperity. Since the time that I came to talk about this issue, I have been saying that it is not a sign of prosperity, it is a sign of misery and poverty. In fact, there is no country in the world which has developed, which has improved their living standard by sending their people to other countries to work. Actually, if they go there as their choice, and they have a wide range of choices, so I choose to go to the Middle East, I choose to go somewhere else, and I choose to stay in Sri Lanka, then it's fine. But this is actually, they do that because they don't have a choice. And what happens is that We are also comfortable with our, because it cushions our foreign exchange problem, because they bring money here and we can also manage our exchange rate and our balance of payment. All. So we are we keep quiet, we keep silent about it. Okay, we are receiving this. But actually it shows that the country, the economy of this country has no capacity to absorb this valuable human resources into our own production process, and that's why I argue always that it is a sign of misery.
Right. Now, Professor, now the Bali Process Government and Business Forum is a worldwide initiative to end modern slavery. Last week, on behalf of the Capital Maharaj organization, I attended the Dubai Working Group meeting where countries came together to brainstorm on how they could end modern slavery, both business and world leaders. Now, in Sri Lanka, we have processes in place, we have laws in place, we have law enforcement mechanisms in place. However, our women keep suffering. How do we resolve this? Where are we going wrong?
As I said, that this is again because we don't have the capacity to provide them opportunities to work here, to contribute to our own development process, and we don't have capacity to provide them enough sufficient reward for that. So that is why some of them, though reluctantly, they choose to go for this work. And I know that this kind of issues and which are happening, as you mentioned, in all these countries which are sending their large part of their labor to mostly to Middle Eastern countries, and like Philippines and Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, they have all these problems. So bringing about regulatory mechanisms and then negotiations and all these things are fine, but it does not mean that we are going to end our fundamental problem here. The problem is at home, and if the country is getting enough, a country's economy is on the track, and if it is moving fast, and if we achieve our growth momentum, and then if our service sector, industrial sector is expanding enough, actually there will be there will be enough opportunities for these people to serve, to contribute to our own development process. And I am sure that majority of those people today who choose to go abroad, they will stay here. They will be happy to stay here.
Thank you very much. On that note, we're going for a short commercial break. You're watching Face the Nation. We'll be right back.